Hey guys, today we're talking about the Queen's Gambit decline, specifically the exchange variation, which is where white trades this pawn very early on. And we're going to talk about not just the lines that are part of that opening, but also some of the plans and ideas going into the middle game that you can use in your games. So let's start at the beginning. The Queen's Gambit is when white plays the move c4. We're gambiting this pawn temporarily. If black wants to, they can accept the gambit with the Queen's Gambit accepted. But if they don't want to do that and they want to just kind of defend their central pawn, they can play the move e6, and this is the Queen's Gambit decline. That's the topic of this video series. This is part 2 in that series. If you want to watch the first part, I'll link that down below. But usually we'll play knight to c3, putting more pressure on that pawn, and then black will play knight to f6, defending it. And the exchange variation starts right here. As white, we can simply take that pawn. And usually black will capture back with the pawn. They could take with the knight, but that kind of leads to some other types of lines, which we're not going to cover. It's much more common that they'll take back with the pawn. And why would we want to do this? Why would we want to trade that pawn right away? Well, for one, and this is probably the main reason, we eliminate a whole bunch of other opening lines in theory that we might have to otherwise learn. Okay, so for example, if you don't take that pawn, at any moment, black could decide, you know what, I'm going to transpose into a Queen's Gambit accepted. For example, let's say we go here. They can transpose to a Queen's Gambit accepted and take that pawn. And now you have to know, what are you going to do, right? And so by clarifying the situation, we eliminate a lot of those extra lines. Also, the pawn structure kind of becomes pretty clear what's happening. We've got these 5 pawns here and 2 over here, and then black has the 4 and the 3. And that is going to be useful in just a little bit when we talk about the plans. You're going to see why we care about that, okay? So we go ahead and trade that off, and then the next move that we're going to play is bishop to g5. And we're developing our pieces, but we're also making an immediate threat on black's center pawn on d5. So for example, if black doesn't see what's happening and they just play a random move like h6 to attack our bishop, do you guys see how we can take advantage of this situation here? There's something going on with these 3 pieces and our knight and our bishop. How can we take advantage of that? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is just take the knight. And black has a tough decision. If they take with the queen, they lose their pawn because the queen no longer defends it. Now we simply take it. We also get a nice attack on the queen. We're also threatening a fork over here, and black's already in trouble, okay? So they probably would take back this way so that the queen defends, but now the downside is that they have really bad pawn structure. These are called double isolated pawns. This is an isolated pawn, and that's really not how you want to start the game with black. Also, if they ever castled over here, notice how their king would be open. So they probably don't want to castle. And this is a very nice position for us. Okay, either way you look at it. So that's kind of the threat behind playing bishop to g5. And most people will simply play the move c6 to defend that pawn. So we can't take it. They don't have to worry about that. However, some people will play the move knight b to d7. And this is actually setting a trap. I wanted to show you this to you guys just so you don't fall into this tricky line. But it looks like this knight is pinned. So he can't move, or we would take black's queen. And if the knight can't move, then can't we just take this pawn for free? Here's what's going to happen if you do that. They're going to take your knight, and you say, Nelson, you just said they couldn't do that because we take the queen. We can take the queen, but black has a really nice follow-up. Bishop to b4 puts us in check, and we have nowhere to move our king to. The only legal move that we have to get out of this check is queen to d2. We have to give up our own queen, and then after we recapture, black takes our bishop, and look what's happened. 1, 2, 3 pieces for black, and we only have 2, not to mention ours aren't really developed. And so black is just winning. And so it's a little trap. It's an opening trap is what that is. And so if they play knight b to d7, you have to remember you can't take that pawn right away. Okay, what I recommend you do here is just play e3. And now you're threatening to take it. Because now, let's just say black wastes a move here. Now you can get away with this, because if black tries to do the same exact thing, when they put you in check, look at this. We have an escape square for our king. The game goes on, and we get to keep our queen, okay? So that's what you can do, play e3, and most likely at this point, they'll play something like bishop e7, and the game will go on. So I just wanted to show you that little trick. But like I said, most people are going to probably play something like c6 here, okay? And then what I'm going to recommend you guys do is play the move queen to c2. Now, there's 2 sort of mainline moves here, queen to c2 and e3. e3, you just don't worry about what I'm going to tell you. But queen c2, we actually try to get control of this diagonal right away so that black can't put their bishop there, right? See, one of the drawbacks of the exchange variation is that when we trade these pawns, it opens up black's bishop, right? So by playing queen c2, we're trying to take away that square. Now, it could still go to g4, but it's not really attacking anything on g4, and we could actually probably chase it around if we want with h3 and g4 maybe later. And so I don't know that black is likely to do that. So queen c2 is what I recommend, and usually here black will play either knight b to d7 or bishop e7, and they usually will kind of transpose to the exact same thing. So let's just say bishop e7 to break our pin. Now you can play e3, knight b to d7, black's developing, bishop to d3, we're creating the battery here, and black usually will castle. They do have that defended with the knight, so they don't have to worry about that. And even if we were to take here, they could recapture with their knight, and so they're covered on that square, okay? So this is the starting position of the kind of the main line of the exchange variation, where I'm going to talk about the 3 different plans as you head into the middle game, the 3 different plans that you can choose as white, okay? So plan number 1 and number 2 involve castling kingside, and plan number 3 involves castling queenside. And we'll talk more about why you would want to castle queenside in a little bit. But let's go ahead and start off with plan number 1. So the first plan that you have here is just the basic knight to f3. Usually black plays rook to e8, getting the rook to the half open file. We're going to castle, right? And this is nothing fancy. We're just completing our development, putting the king in a very safe place, right? We've got a wall of pawns over here. Generally speaking, castling kingside is one of the safest places you can put your king. That's exactly what we're doing. Usually black will do something like knight to f8 just to let the bishop out. And here is where you would launch what's called a minority attack. Now, I have a whole video on a minority attack, what it is, how to do it. I'm going to link that down below. You can go watch that if you want more details. But essentially, if you look at this section of the board right here, these 3 files, so the A, B, and C files, okay? If you count the pawns, we have 2 pawns, black has 3 pawns. And so a minority attack is where we're going to actually attack with our 2 pawns against these 3 pawns. And you say, Nelson, why would we want to do that if we only have 2 and we're attacking 3? The point is we want to create a weakness, okay? And so the way that it would look would be like b4. I'm going to just waste some moves here for black. b5, just wasting moves for black. And we capture. Okay, this is the goal. Now, obviously, black didn't try to stop us in that example, which, you know, they're going to try to stop you in a real game. But why did we do that? Because this guy right here is a good target. This is called a backward pawn in chess, because no pawns can support it as it tries to move forward. This pawn is gone, and this pawn has already been pushed forward. So this guy's backward, and so we could do something like knight to a4, and that's a target for us. We could bring the rook over, we could pile up on it, we could bring the knight in, and it's very difficult for black to defend that pawn because it's backward, okay? That's kind of the dream. That's the perfect setup that you could get from doing a minority attack. Now, of course, black is not just going to let us push that, and you may have noticed that as soon as we played b4, if black was paying attention, they would have taken our pawn, right? So you're going to have to do some setup to do that minority attack. Usually it's rook a to b1. And again, if black is wasting moves, now you would play b4, and then you would play b5, right? And trade this off. And of course, if they take us, well, now this pawn becomes much weaker, right? You can imagine how we can start piling up on this pawn, which is an isolated pawn, because the pawn's no longer defended, okay? So that's kind of the point behind a minority attack. Sometimes, you know, after you play b4, black plays a move like a6 to try to stop you, and you can play a4, and you can, you know, get ready to do it again. And it becomes this battle of, can they stop your minority attack? The other way that black could play, and we'll see this in an example in just a second, the other way that they could play is just to ignore what you're doing and try to attack on the king side, okay? And a lot of times they might do some sort of hybrid where they, you know, try to slow you down a little bit over here, but then they also launch an attack on the king side, and that's kind of how the game might go, okay? So that's plan number 1. You castle, and then you do the minority attack on the queen side, okay? So let's actually look at a game between 2 very high-rated players to see how this went in practice, okay? All right, so here's the game. It's between Vladimir Kramnik and Gary Kasparov, which are 2 former world champions. Okay, so they're both 2,800 rated range. And again, and we've seen this before in part 1 of this series, where it doesn't start out as a Queen's Gambit. It starts out as a different opening, a ready opening, and then we transpose eventually into a Queen's Gambit. Okay, and so now you can see it's starting to look more like the Queen's Gambit decline setup. And then here is where Kramnik makes the decision to take it into an exchange variation. All right, so here we go. E3, bishop e7, bishop d3, And here we reach the position that I mentioned, right, where these plans can start. Okay, so watch what happens. Rook to e8, castles. Okay, so Kramnik has played knight to f3 and castled kingside, just like I mentioned, plan number one. Knight to f8 and rook a to b1. And he's getting ready, if, Kasparov lets him, to do a minority attack. He's going to push this pawn up here and he's going to trade it off. But watch what Kasparov does. a5. And this is pretty common, where if your opponent knows what's going on. Now, this is a much more advanced plan. So if you're playing this at the 600, 800, even 1,000 or 1,200 level, most players are going to have no idea what a minority attack is. Okay, so you're not going to see people stopping you. But if you get up to the 16, 1,800, 2,000 level, people sometimes realize, and they will try to stop you. That's what's happening here. He's trying to make it difficult for Kramnik to play that. So Kramnik plays a3. He has the option now to play b4, and it's defended. He can continue attacking. And now Kramnik decides to abandon the plan and change gears. Now, why did he decide this? I have no idea. He could have very well continued with b4 and done, the minority attack, and I don't know what would have happened in the game. We'll never know, right? But in this particular game, he decided to change plans and bring the rook over here and, just kind of completely different setup. Why did he do that? Again, I have no idea, right? I have no idea. So maybe this wasn't the best example, but I just wanted to kind of bring up the fact that, hey, sometimes you do have to adapt, and that's okay. That's what we see here. But yeah, like I said, go watch that other video where I talk about the minority attack in more detail if you'd like to see some more examples of how it works out in practice. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back to our discussion here of the options that we have. Okay, so let's go ahead and go through the main line here. So we're going to exchange, bring the bishop out, c6, e3, or actually, sorry, queen to c2 first is what I'm recommending to get control of that diagonal. And then once we have control, then we play e3, bishop to d3, castles. And we just talked about knight to f3, and castling was one option. Let's go to the second option that you have. The second option is you put your knight on e2 instead of f3, and we're going to see why we might want to do that in just a second. And then here, let's say rook to e8, castles kingside again. So remember, both plan number one and plan number two involve castling kingside. And if black follows the standard plan here, knight to f8, now you could play the move f3. And this is why we didn't want to put the knight there, because we wanted to be able to push our pawn. And why are we doing that? Because we want to play e4. And we want to get this big pawn center, get two pawns in the center so that we can get lots of control. And the way to do that is to get this extra pawn helping us out, right? So that's kind of the idea, right? And then I don't know what black's going to do, something like this. Usually you'll bring this rook over to help support this pawn, since it's not really doing much in the corner anyway. And then, you would try to play e4. And if black takes, you have this pawn ready to go, and you have that nice pawn center like I mentioned. And your plan is basically to look for opportunities to push these guys forward at the right moment. Okay, so let's actually look at a high-rated game and see how they played with this plan in mind. All right, here's the next game between two 2,600 rated players. And again, you're going to notice it doesn't start out with d4, right? So this is very common at the top level where they transpose from one opening into another. But you're going to see now, here we are a couple moves later, and this is the exact same position that we've seen before, right? So white captures, brings the bishop out, bishop to e7. And they decided to play e3 instead of the queen c2 line. So they are allowing black to get that diagonal if black wants. It will lead to different type of position, different type of stuff will happen. But this person decides to not develop the bishop, and now white gets control and will transpose into the exact same line that I showed you guys, right? So knight comes to e2, castles kingside, queen to c2. Okay, so it was a little bit of a roundabout way, different moves here and there, but we end up with the exact same position. Okay, everything is exactly the same as what I showed you guys. Knight goes back to f8 and f3. Here we go. He's setting up to play e4 and get control of the center. So bishop e6 brings the rook over, just like I mentioned. Rook to c8 and e4. And here we go. White has control of the center. These pawns do get traded. And then black goes on the offensive and creates a threat on the bishop. Now, white could have traded, but then it kind of frees up black's position. Black's position is a little bit cramped. There's a lot of pieces there that don't have a lot of squares to work with. And so a lot of times when you trade, it makes life easier on your opponent in those situations. And so white decides to go back to f4 here, which I think was a good practical decision you know, kind of keeps these pieces like they are. Knight comes to g6, e5. Very nice move here, unleashing the queen and the bishop and attacking this pawn on h7. So if this knight were to capture here, black would lose the pawn with check and the king would be exposed. Okay, so nice move there. And you're going to see another reason why this move is useful in just a little while. So as the game goes on, we get some trades. And then watch what happens. By the way, this is pretty common, putting both rooks behind these two center pawns so that they're ready to support them if they want to move forward. But right here, watch what happens. Knight to e4. Remember I said this pawn was supporting d6 earlier? Now you can see why. The knight's going to come in, and there's a potential for a triple fork there, and that's exactly what happens. And it gets a little bit tricky here. There's some tactical stuff going on, which I'm not going to get into, but white got into a pretty nice position and went on to win this game. Okay, we're not going to focus any more past this because it is an opening video, but the takeaway is that once you get that pawn center, then you're going to kind of react to what black is going to do, right? Black's going to do something. In this case, they decided to go for this idea, but you're going to react to what they do and look for good opportunities, like right here, we saw one, to push these pawns forward and use those pawns to help you. In this case, it was to bring that knight over to d6 eventually, right? It didn't happen right away, but later white saw the opportunity, and then you see the knight came in and got the fork. Okay, so that's plan number 2. Let's go back to the beginning, and we'll talk about the third and final option. So here we go. Let's go through the line again. Exchange variation, we take it right away. Bishop g5, c6, queen to c2, getting control of that diagonal right away. Knight b to d7, bishop d3, castles. Okay, here's the starting position. So plan number 1 we looked at. Knight to f3, castles, and then you launch the minority attack on the queen side, trying to create a backward pawn. Plan number 2 was knight to e2, castle kingside, and then f3 and e4, just trying to build up a big center and going from there. And plan number 3 is actually knight to e2, and then you castle queenside. And this is very interesting because usually when you castle opposite sides of your opponent, that's a signal, or it could be a signal that you're going to try to attack them with your pawns. See, normally you don't want to be moving your pawns in front of your king. So if you were to castle here and start moving your pawns, that wouldn't make sense. But if you castle over here, guess what? There's no reason you shouldn't push these pawns forward and attack your opponent's king. But at the same time, black's going to do the same thing, right? It's a double-edged sword. So you get some wild games a lot of times when you do this. And if that's the kind of style that you like, by all means, man, go for it. Personally, I like to play games like this. I think it's a lot of fun. Lots of tactical opportunities, lots of calculating. Can I defend? Should I go for the offensive? What's the best thing to do? Really fun games, in my opinion. So I like this, okay? And if you're worried about your king being open, there are a lot of pieces over here defending it. And you can always step over to b1 if you need to get out of this c file. But it's going to take black some time before they can get a rook there to really put pressure on your king. Ideally, they're going to try to play c5 and probably take here, move this, bring the rook over. But like I said, it's going to take some time. All right, so we castle queenside, and the plan is basically to attack the king. Usually h3 and g4 is how you're going to set that up. Probably the rook can come over, and then you can just kind of keep pushing these pawns forward and look for opportunities to attack the king. All right, so let's go ahead and look at a high-rated game where we see this in action. All right, so here we go. Again, two 2,600 rated players, and they actually start out the exact same way that I kind of showed you. You see white decides to not go for that queen c2 line right away, but black doesn't take advantage of that, and so they don't actually get control of that diagonal. Okay, queen c2, and here we are. We've transposed to the exact same position. So the knight goes to e2, rook to e8, and castle queenside. Now the engine is going to say some things like, why are you doing that? But practically, it's totally fine. Don't even worry about that. Okay, so b6, king to b1. This is pretty common. A lot of strong players, they know that at some point in the future this might happen and this might get traded, and they might want to be away from there with their king, and so they just go ahead and do it right away, just to not have to worry about it. But bishop to b7, h3. So you can see kind of the general approach. You want to play g4, the knight's defending, so you play h3 to kind of set it up. c5, g4. And so we can see black is getting ready to attack over here on the queen side, where white's king is, and white is getting ready to attack over here, where black's king is. Okay, this is kind of what you can expect when you castle queenside. This is how the game might go against a strong player, right? So the rook comes over. It's saying it's a blunder. I mean, it's one of those engine moves where it's not really a blunder. Engine just really liked the move c4 here. And I guess the idea is that the bishop is sort of trapped after g6. Now, I imagine white was just planning on trading. So what exactly is the problem here? Yeah, the computer just says this is really good for black, which, okay, I don't know. I'm not going to get too bogged down in that. The human move is rook to c8. Very human move right there. Bishop takes, and then g5. This is pretty standard. You trade off that bishop because you want to be able to push those pawns forward. And once you get rid of those pawns, the rooks can be, get involved, and that's where you really attack the king. That's kind of how you would pawn storm. You want to trade off those pawns so that the rooks can be involved. Okay. So the knight comes in, get this trade, and it starts to get pretty wild, right? You can see already it's starting to heat up. Black is creating some threats here. White is trying to attack on the other side. Here's h4, right? Let's go a little bit further, see how this game actually played out. The knight comes in, and yeah, this is pretty typical. White's got the attack going on the king side. Black's got some threats on the queen side. This is actually interesting in that black has the two bishops, white has the two knights. There goes one of them, and yeah, pretty standard stuff. White's trying to attack, black's trying to attack. Very tricky game. And black actually resigned here because the bishop was hanging, although I believe there was so what's happening here, if you're wondering, this was actually a really good move. It's threatening the bishop. It's also threatening a checkmate here. So for example, if black, let's just say, tries to defend the bishop and white trades, and this happens, check. And that's actually a back rank checkmate. So the reason is there was two threats, 1 and 2, and I guess black can't really defend both of them. Anyway, the point is that when you castle queenside, you can expect a game similar to that, where black's going to be doing something to attack over here. There's lots of different ways. You're going to be attacking over here, and it's going to be a pretty fun and exciting game. All right. So just to recap, you've got 3 plans coming out of the Queen's Gambit accepted exchange variation. Okay, so bishop g5, c6, queen c2, and knight bd7, bishop d3 castles. You've got knight f3 castles and launch a minority attack, number 1. You've got knight e2 castles and then f3 e4, get the big center, plan number 2. And then plan number 3, knight to e2 castle queenside and launch an attack over here and try to defend yourself against black's attack. All right, those are kind of the 3 typical common good plans for white out of the exchange variation. Let me know if you guys have questions. Don't forget, go watch that other video on the minority attack if you would like. I'll also link part 1 of this series where we talked about a different variation out of the Queen's Gambit declined. And we'll just keep going and building these videos out till we have a full repertoire in the Queen's Gambit decline. All right, guys, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.